December 19, 1944. The Ardennes forest in Belgium lay buried beneath 3 feet of snow, and temperatures had plummeted to 15 degrees below zero. Private First Class Marcus Jefferson knelt beside a frozen creek bed, his hands clasped together, his breath forming small clouds in the bitter air as he whispered words that no one else could hear. Around him, the men of the 333rd Quartermaster Company huddled in their foxholes, their teeth chattering, their fingers too numb to properly grip their rifles. They were a supply unit, trained to drive trucks and move ammunition, not to hold a defensive line against an advancing enemy force. Yet here they were, cut off from the main American positions, surrounded by dense forest, and running desperately low on everything they needed to survive. What those shivering men did not yet understand was that over the next 72 hours, every assumption they held about courage, faith, and the meaning of heroism would be completely shattered. The soldier they had dismissed as weak, the man they had mocked for closing his eyes when he should have been watching the tree line, would become the reason any of them lived to see Christmas morning. Before we dive into this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. This is the remarkable true account of how one man's unshakable faith transformed not only his own destiny, but the lives of every soldier who witnessed what he did. It is a story about the power of conviction in the face of impossible odds, about the redemption that comes when prejudice gives way to understanding, and about the extraordinary things that ordinary people can accomplish when they refuse to abandon hope. Marcus Jefferson was born on March 3, 1922, in a small town called Greenwood, Mississippi, the youngest of 7 children, in a family that had worked the same piece of farmland for 3 generations. His father, Samuel Jefferson, was a deacon at the Mount Zion Baptist Church, a man who could quote scripture from memory and who believed with every fiber of his being that faith without works was dead. His mother, Bessie, was known throughout the county for her healing hands. People would travel for miles to have her pray over them when they were sick, and many swore that her prayers had cured everything from pneumonia to broken hearts. The Jefferson farm sat on 40 acres of Black Delta soil, land that had been purchased by Marcus's grandfather in 1892, with money saved over 20 years of sharecropping. It was not wealthy land, but it was their land, and that made all the difference. Every morning the family would gather in the kitchen before dawn, and Samuel would lead them in devotions that could last 30 minutes or more. They would sing hymns in 4-part harmony, their voices blending together in the darkness, and then they would kneel on the hard wooden floor while Samuel prayed for guidance, for protection, for the strength to meet whatever the day might bring. Growing up in that household, Marcus learned that prayer was not passive. It was not an excuse to avoid action or a refuge for the weak. Prayer, his father taught him, was preparation. It was the gathering of strength before the storm. It was the sharpening of the spirit before the test. Samuel Jefferson had a saying he repeated so often that his children could recite it in their sleep. Pray like everything depends on God, then work like everything depends on you. Marcus took those words to heart and made them the foundation of his life. He was a quiet child, more comfortable with books and machines than with the rough games the other boys played. By the time he was 12, he could take apart and reassemble the old tractor that his father used to plow the fields, and by 15, he was known throughout the county as the young man you called when your car or your farm equipment broke down and no one else could figure out why. He had a gift for understanding how things worked, for listening to an engine and knowing exactly what was wrong with it, for coaxing life back into equipment that other mechanics had given up on. But Marcus also had something else, something that set him apart even from his devout siblings. He had a faith that seemed to come from somewhere beyond himself, a certainty and a peace that could not be shaken by the hardships and injustices that surrounded him. When the white boys from town threw rocks at him on his way to school, he did not respond with anger or dreams of revenge. When the storekeeper in Greenwood shortchanged him and then dared him to do something about it, he simply noted the loss and moved on. His mother worried that he was too gentle for the world he lived in, but his father understood. "That boy has something," Samuel told his wife. "Something most people never find. Don't try to change it. Just pray it protects him." When the global conflict began spreading across Europe and the Pacific in 1941, Marcus was 19 years old and working as a mechanic at a cotton gin in Greenwood. The news came over the radio in fragmented reports that seemed to describe a world very far away, a world of armies and navies and battles that had nothing to do with life in the Mississippi Delta. But Marcus sensed, with the same intuition that let him diagnose a failing engine, that this distant conflict would eventually reach into his life and change it forever. The draft notice arrived in February of 1943. Marcus reported to the induction center in Jackson with the same quiet acceptance he brought to everything in his life. He did not complain about being sent to a segregated training camp. He did not protest when he was assigned to a quartermaster unit instead of a combat division. He simply did what was asked of him and did it well. Basic training took place at Camp Lee in Virginia, a sprawling installation where black soldiers were housed in separate barracks, ate in separate mess halls, and were trained by a cadre of officers who made no secret of their belief that these men were suited only for labor and support roles. The camp was a study in contradictions, a place where men were being trained to fight for freedom while experiencing a denial of their own freedom at every turn. Separate and unequal was the rule, and anyone who questioned it found themselves on permanent latrine duty or worse. Marcus excelled in everything related to vehicles and logistics. He could strip down a 2.5-ton cargo truck and rebuild it in half the time it took other trainees. He memorized supply codes and routing procedures with ease. He earned high marks in every technical evaluation and drew the attention of his superiors, who began assigning him to the most complex mechanical problems that arose in the motor pool. But he also earned a reputation for something else. Every night, after the other men in his barracks had settled into their bunks to play cards or write letters, or simply collapse from exhaustion, Marcus would kneel beside his bed and pray. Not a quick, perfunctory prayer, but a long, focused communion that could last 30 minutes or more. He would close his eyes and bow his head and move his lips silently, and nothing could disturb him once he had begun. The other soldiers found this strange at first, then annoying, and finally worthy of open mockery. Corporal James Turner, a sharp-tongued man from Chicago who had appointed himself the unofficial social arbiter of the barracks, was particularly relentless. Turner was 24 years old, a former numbers runner who had grown up on the South Side, and who viewed any display of sincere religious devotion as evidence of weakness or simple-mindedness. He was smart and charismatic and quick-witted, the kind of man who could make others laugh with a well-timed joke or cringe with a cutting remark. And he had decided that Marcus Jefferson's nightly prayers were the perfect target for his humor. "Hey, Jefferson, you asking the Lord to send you a backbone?" Turner would call out as Marcus knelt by his bunk. "Maybe pray for some common sense while you're at it." The other soldiers would laugh, and Turner would continue, warming to his theme. "I bet he's praying for a transfer to a nice, safe desk job, or maybe for a divine miracle that'll send him home early. What's the matter, preacher? Army life too hard for you?" The laughter would ripple through the barracks, and some of the men would join in with their own comments, feeding off Turner's energy. But Marcus would simply continue his prayers as if he had not heard a word. When he was finished, he would rise to his feet, climb into his bunk and go to sleep, never once acknowledging the mockery or showing any sign that it had affected him. Private William Foster, a quiet man from rural Georgia who bunked next to Marcus, was puzzled by this response. Foster had grown up in a religious household himself and felt uncomfortable with the nightly ritual of humiliation, but he was too shy to say anything about it. One night after the laughter had died down and the barracks had gone dark, he leaned over and whispered to Marcus, "Doesn't it bother you what Turner says?" Marcus was quiet for a moment, and Foster thought perhaps he had not heard the question, but then his voice came back soft and calm. "My mama always told me that a dog that barks at every passing car never catches anything. I'm not here to catch Corporal Turner. I'm here to do my job and keep my soul right." Foster nodded slowly, not entirely understanding, but sensing that there was something in Marcus Jefferson that went deeper than anything he had encountered before. The weeks of basic training became months, and the 333rd Quartermaster Company began to take shape as a unit. There were 120 men in the company, all of them black, led by a cadre of white officers who ranged from genuinely decent to barely concealed in their contempt. The commanding officer, Captain Harold Mitchell, was somewhere in the middle, a career army man who treated the men fairly, but kept his distance and never challenged the segregated system that defined their existence. Marcus made a few friends during those months, men who appreciated his skill with vehicles and his willingness to help with any problem. Foster was one of them, a reliable if unambitious soldier who was content to do his job and stay out of trouble. Another was Private Albert Green, a 19-year-old from Alabama who had lied about his age to enlist and who looked up to Marcus as a kind of older brother. Green was eager and earnest and full of questions, and Marcus took the time to answer them, teaching him not just about trucks and engines but about patience and perseverance, and the importance of doing every task, no matter how small, to the best of your ability. Turner remained hostile, but even he began to grudgingly acknowledge Marcus's technical skills. When a truck broke down in the motor pool and no one could figure out why, it was Marcus who diagnosed the problem and fixed it. When the supply inventory kept coming up short and the officers were threatening punishment, it was Marcus who found the error in the paperwork and corrected it. He never bragged about these achievements or used them to answer the mockery. He simply did his job and let the work speak for itself. In August of 1944, the 333rd received orders to ship overseas. They departed from Camp Lee on a train that took them to New York, where they boarded a converted passenger liner that had been painted grey and stripped of its peacetime luxuries. The ship was packed with soldiers, most of them white, and the black troops were assigned to the lowest decks, cramped quarters with poor ventilation that became a sweltering nightmare once they entered the warm waters of the Atlantic. The crossing took 12 days. 12 days of tedium and seasickness, and constant worry about German submarines that might be lurking beneath the surface. Marcus spent much of the voyage on deck, when he could manage it, watching the endless grey ocean and praying for the safety of the men around him. He had never seen the ocean before, had never imagined that so much water could exist in one place, and it filled him with a sense of awe that reinforced his faith. Whatever power had created this, he thought, was more than capable of protecting them through what lay ahead. They landed at Le Havre, France, which had been liberated just weeks earlier and was still a landscape of rubble and ruin. The harbour was clogged with sunken ships, and the city itself was little more than piles of broken stone where buildings had once stood. The smell of smoke and decay hung in the air, and the faces of the French civilians who watched them pass were gaunt with hunger and exhaustion. Marcus looked at the destruction around him and felt something shift inside his chest. This was what conflict did. This was what they were here to end. From Le Havre, they were trucked to a supply depot near the city of Liège in Belgium, where they would spend the next 2 months loading and unloading ammunition, fuel, and rations for the units pushing toward the German border. The work was tedious and exhausting, 12-hour shifts of lifting and carrying and stacking, but it was essential to the effort. Without fuel, the tanks and trucks could not advance. Without ammunition, the infantry could not fight. Without food, the soldiers could not survive. The men of the 333rd were the links in a chain that stretched from the factories of America to the front lines of Europe, and Marcus took pride in being part of it. He became known as the man you wanted working on your truck if it broke down, the man who could find a replacement part when the supply sergeant swore nothing was available, the man who never complained about pulling a double shift or volunteering for a difficult run. The officers noticed, and in early December, Marcus was promoted to the rank of corporal and given responsibility for a 5-vehicle section. It was a small command, but it was a sign of trust and respect that meant more to him than any medal. But the mocking continued. Now it came not just from Turner, but from others who had decided that Marcus Jefferson's faith was incompatible with being a real soldier. They called him preacher, in a tone that made the word sound like an insult. They would deliberately jostle him during evening prayers, pretending it was an accident. They would make loud, vulgar jokes specifically designed to interrupt his devotions. And they would question, always within his hearing, whether a man who spent so much time on his knees could be trusted to stand up when it mattered. Through it all, Marcus remained calm. He did his job. He helped anyone who asked for help. He prayed, and he waited for the moment when he would have the chance to show them what faith really meant. December 16, 1944, began like any other day at the Liège depot. The men rose before dawn, ate a breakfast of powdered eggs and toast in the mess tent, and reported to their assigned duties. The weather was cold but clear, the sky a pale grey that promised neither sun nor snow. Marcus was scheduled to lead a convoy of 5 trucks to a forward supply point near the town of Stavelot, about 40 miles to the southeast. It was a routine run, one they had made dozens of times before. The convoy assembled at 06:30 hours, the trucks lined up in the motor pool with their engines warming and their cargoes secured beneath canvas tarps. Marcus walked the line, checking each vehicle and speaking briefly with each driver, making sure everyone knew the route and the schedule. He was a careful leader, thorough and methodical, and the men in his section had come to appreciate his attention to detail, even if they did not always understand his quieter qualities. At 0700 hours, the convoy rolled out of the depot and onto the icy roads heading southeast. Marcus was driving the lead truck, a 2.5-ton cargo vehicle loaded with ammunition crates. In the passenger seat beside him was Corporal Turner, who had been assigned to the convoy as a communications specialist, responsible for maintaining radio contact with the depot. Turner had complained bitterly about being paired with preacher boy, but orders were orders. He settled into his seat with a sour expression and fiddled with the radio as they drove. For the first hour they rode in tense silence. The only sounds were the rumble of the engine, the crunch of tires on packed snow, and the occasional crackle of static from the radio. Marcus focused on the road, which was narrow and winding and slick with ice in the shadowed sections where the weak winter sun did not reach. The convoy maintained a steady pace, fast enough to make good time, but slow enough to avoid accidents. Then the radio crackled to life with a transmission that made no sense. Fragmented reports of German armor breaking through to the south, panicked calls for reinforcement from units they had never heard of, orders to hold position followed immediately by orders to retreat. The airwaves were a jumble of overlapping voices, static and confusion. Turner adjusted the frequency, trying to get clearer information, but every channel seemed worse than the last. "What the hell is going on?" Turner muttered. "This sounds like a complete mess." Marcus did not answer. He was listening to the radio with a growing sense of unease. Something had gone terribly wrong somewhere, something that was affecting the entire front. He pulled the convoy to a halt at a crossroads and stepped out of the truck to consult his map. They were about 15 miles from Stavelot, in hilly terrain covered with dense stands of evergreen trees. The road ahead wound through a narrow valley that offered little room to maneuver. To the north was a ridgeline that blocked visibility in that direction. To the south and west were thick forests that could hide almost anything. Marcus felt a prickling sensation at the back of his neck, an instinct honed by years of hunting with his father in the Mississippi woods. Something was not right. He gathered the drivers and assistant drivers from the other 4 trucks, 12 men in all, and explained the situation. No one knew exactly what was happening, but it was clear that their planned route might no longer be safe. They had 3 options: continue to Stavelot as ordered, turn back to Liège, or find an alternate route that would avoid whatever trouble was brewing to the south. "I think we should turn back," Marcus said, "at least until we can get clearer information about what's going on. There's no point in driving into a situation we don't understand." Turner stepped forward immediately. "We have orders," he said. "We're supposed to deliver these supplies, and that's what we're going to do. The front needs this ammunition. We can't just tuck tail and run back to base because we heard some confusing radio traffic." "I'm not suggesting we abandon the mission," Marcus replied. "I'm suggesting we wait until we know more. Better to delay the delivery by a few hours than to lose it entirely." "And who made you the expert on tactics? You're a mechanic, Jefferson. You fix trucks. You don't make strategic decisions." "I'm the convoy leader, Corporal. That makes it my responsibility to make decisions about the convoy." The 2 men faced each other, and the other soldiers watched tensely. Turner outranked Marcus by date of promotion, but Marcus was in command of this specific mission. It was an ambiguous situation, the kind that led to paralysis when decisive action was needed most. Before they could resolve the argument, the decision was made for them. From somewhere to the south came a sound that made every man freeze, the distinctive rumble of tracked vehicles, and a lot of them. It was coming closer. Private Foster, who had been standing at the edge of the tree line, came running back with his face pale. "Tanks," he said, "coming up the road from the south. At least a dozen, maybe more, and they're not ours." For a moment, no one moved. They were supply troops with only rifles and a single machine gun mounted on one of the trucks. They had no anti-tank weapons, no way to call for support, and nowhere to hide 5 large vehicles on a narrow road surrounded by forest. They were going to be overrun. Marcus felt a strange calm settle over him. He had felt this before, in moments of crisis back home, when his father would place a hand on his shoulder and remind him that panic was the enemy of clear thinking. He closed his eyes for just a moment, offered a silent prayer for guidance, and then opened them again with a plan already forming in his mind. "We can't outrun tanks," he said, his voice steady and clear, "and we can't hide the trucks. But we can hide ourselves. Foster, how far back is that creek bed we crossed about a mile ago?" Foster thought for a moment. "Maybe 1,000 yards. The banks are steep on both sides, good cover. That's where we go. We drive the trucks into the trees as far as they'll go, disable the engines so the Germans can't use them, take everything we can carry and move to the creek bed on foot. We stay hidden until we can figure out what's happening and find a way back to our lines." Turner stepped forward, his jaw tight with anger. "You want us to abandon our vehicles and our cargo? That's desertion. That's cowardice." Marcus met his gaze without flinching. "It's survival, Corporal. Those trucks aren't worth our lives. The cargo can be replaced. We can't. Now we have about 3 minutes to make this happen, so I suggest we stop arguing and start moving." The other men looked between Marcus and Turner, uncertain. Turner outranked Marcus by date of promotion, but there was something in Marcus's voice, a certainty and authority that went beyond rank, that made them want to follow him. In the end, it was Private Albert Green, the youngest among them, who broke the stalemate. He walked to his truck and started to unload supplies. One by one, the others followed. They worked with frantic efficiency, driven by the growing rumble of tanks that seemed to get closer with every passing second. They drove the trucks off the road and into the dense undergrowth, forcing them through the brush until they became hopelessly stuck. Then they smashed the distributors and drained the oil to render the engines useless, ensuring that even if the Germans found the vehicles, they would not be able to use them. Each man grabbed what he could carry: ammunition, rations, water, blankets, medical supplies. Marcus made sure they took the machine gun and all its ammunition belts. Every round might matter before this was over. Then they moved out, jogging through the snow-covered forest toward the creek bed, their breath coming in ragged gasps, their legs burning with effort. Marcus led the way, following the route he had memorized during the drive-in, moving as fast as he dared while still maintaining noise discipline. Behind him, the men struggled to keep up, burdened by their loads and hampered by the deep snow that dragged at their legs with every step. They reached the creek bed with perhaps 30 seconds to spare. Marcus directed them into positions along the steep banks, spacing them out so they would not present a concentrated target, making sure everyone had cover from both the road above and any approach along the creek itself. Then he knelt in the snow and bowed his head in prayer. Turner, crouching a few yards away, let out a sound of disgust. "This is perfect. We're about to be captured or worse, and the man in charge is talking to his imaginary friend. We're all going to die because of this Bible-thumping fool." Marcus did not respond. He finished his prayer, opened his eyes, and raised his head to watch the road above them. Moments later, the first German tank rumbled past, its treads grinding against the frozen ground, its engine roaring with power that made the earth tremble beneath them. Then another, and another. They could feel the vibration through the earth, could smell the exhaust fumes drifting down into the creek bed, could hear the shouts of German soldiers riding on the tanks or marching alongside them. The column seemed endless, tank after tank after tank, interspersed with trucks full of soldiers and half-tracks towing artillery pieces. No one moved. No one spoke. They barely breathed. Marcus silently counted the vehicles as they passed, keeping track of the enemy strength out of habit more than any tactical purpose. He counted 14 tanks of various sizes, 23 trucks, 11 half-tracks, and more infantry than he could estimate. It was a major force, clearly part of something much larger, and they were heading west toward the American rear areas, The column took nearly 20 minutes to pass, and when it was finally gone, the silence that followed seemed almost sacred. The men remained motionless in their positions, afraid that the slightest movement might draw attention, until Marcus finally raised his hand and signaled that it was safe to stir. "What was that?" Green whispered, his voice shaking. "I don't know," Marcus replied, "but it's big. We need to stay put until we can figure out what's happening." They stayed in the creek bed until nightfall, not daring to move in daylight with German forces clearly in control of the roads. Marcus used the time to take stock of their situation. They had 13 men, all uninjured. They had the machine gun with about 500 rounds, plus their individual rifles with perhaps 60 rounds each. They had enough rations for 3 days if they were careful, and enough water for 2. They had 4 blankets among them, which was not nearly enough for the below-freezing temperatures they would face through the night. As darkness fell and the temperature plummeted, Marcus gathered the men together and laid out the situation with complete honesty. They were in serious trouble, but they were not helpless. Their best chance was to move north and west, toward the American rear areas, traveling at night to avoid German patrols and hiding during the day. It would be slow and dangerous, but it was possible. They would need to work together, conserve their strength, and stay alert. "And we'll need to have faith," Marcus added. "Faith that we can get through this. Faith that we're not alone out here." Turner let out a bitter laugh. "Faith. That's your answer to everything, isn't it, Jefferson? We're stuck behind enemy lines with no support and no way out, and you want us to have faith. Faith in what, exactly? Your God who let us get into this mess in the first place." The other men shifted uncomfortably. Turner was voicing what some of them were thinking, but his words seemed wrong somehow, disrespectful not just to Marcus, but to the gravity of their situation. Marcus looked at Turner with an expression that was neither angry nor defensive, just calm and certain. "I have faith that we're here for a reason, Corporal. I have faith that if we do everything in our power to survive and help each other, we'll find a way through this. And I have faith that every one of us has more strength than we know. That's what I'm asking you to believe in, not miracles, ourselves." There was a long silence. The wind picked up, carrying the distant sound of explosions from somewhere to the south. The conflict was spreading, growing, consuming everything in its path, and they were alone in the middle of it. Then Private Green spoke up. "I believe you, Corporal Jefferson. Tell us what to do." One by one, the others nodded their agreement. Even Turner, after a long moment, gave a grudging nod. It was not acceptance, not yet, but it was enough to move forward. They set out at 2100 hours, with Marcus on point and Foster bringing up the rear. The snow had stopped falling, but the sky remained overcast, blocking any moonlight and making navigation difficult. Marcus led them by compass and instinct, keeping to the forest where possible, and crossing open ground only when absolutely necessary. He moved slowly and deliberately, stopping every few minutes to listen and scan the terrain ahead. The forest was full of noises, the creak of branches, the rustle of small animals, the distant rumble of artillery to the south. But so far, no Germans. By midnight they had covered perhaps 3 miles. A painfully slow pace, but the best they could manage in the darkness and rough terrain. The men were exhausted, their feet numb with cold, their hands raw from gripping their weapons. Marcus called a halt in a dense thicket of young pines that offered good concealment, and the men collapsed into the snow. They did not dare light a fire, so they huddled together for warmth, sharing the blankets as best they could. Marcus took the first watch, stationing himself at the edge of the thicket, where he could see the surrounding terrain. The cold bit into him immediately, the kind of cold that seemed to penetrate through layers of clothing and settle directly into his bones. He stamped his feet and blew on his hands and tried to stay alert. As he watched, he prayed, not for miracles or divine intervention, but for the clarity to make good decisions and the strength to see them through. He prayed for the men who had placed their lives in his hands, men who had mocked him and doubted him, but who were now depending on him to get them home. He prayed for his mother and father back in Mississippi, who had no idea where he was or what he was facing. And he prayed for the German soldiers out there in the darkness, young men like himself, who had been sent to fight and struggle for reasons they probably did not fully understand. It was the prayer his father had taught him to pray for enemies. Not that they be overcome, but that they be touched by grace. The night passed without incident, and at first light they moved again, pushing north through terrain that grew increasingly rugged. The forest gave way to hills covered with dense undergrowth, and the going became even slower. Men stumbled and fell, their legs too weak and too cold to lift properly over the roots and rocks that littered the ground. By midday, Marcus realized they were not going to make it to safety before they ran out of food. They would need to find additional supplies somewhere, which meant taking risks they had so far avoided. It was Private Foster who spotted the farmhouse. It sat in a small valley between two hills, a modest stone building with a barn and several outbuildings. Smoke was rising from the chimney, which meant someone was home. The question was whether they were friendly or hostile. Belgium had been occupied by Germany for 4 years, and the population's sympathies were divided. Some Belgians were eager to help the Americans, while others had collaborated with the occupiers and might well turn them in. Marcus studied the farmhouse through his binoculars for nearly an hour, looking for any sign of German presence. He saw none, but that did not mean it was safe. Finally, he made a decision. He would go down alone and make contact. If it was a trap, only he would be caught and the others could continue without him. Turner objected immediately. "That's stupid. If something happens to you, we don't have anyone else who can navigate. We need you here." "Then I'll teach you before I go," Marcus replied. He spent the next 30 minutes showing Turner how to use the compass and map, drilling him on the route they needed to follow, and the landmarks they would use to guide them. Then he handed over his rifle and ammunition. "I'll go unarmed, less threatening that way. If I'm not back in 2 hours, you take the men and keep moving. Don't come looking for me. Get to American lines and report what happened. That's an order." Turner started to protest again, but something in Marcus's voice stopped him. It was not stubbornness or foolhardiness. It was conviction. Marcus believed this was the right thing to do, and he was going to do it regardless of the risk to himself. 2 hours, Turner said finally. "Then we move." Marcus nodded and made his way down the hillside, moving slowly and keeping his hands visible. His heart was pounding, and he could feel sweat forming on his back despite the cold. This was either going to save them or doom them, and there was no way to know which until he knocked on that door. He reached the farmhouse and approached the front door, pausing to take a deep breath and say one more prayer. Then he knocked. A long moment passed. He could hear movement inside, voices speaking in rapid French. Then the door opened to reveal an elderly man with white hair, a weathered face, and deeply suspicious eyes. Behind him, Marcus could see an elderly woman and 2 younger women, who might have been their daughters. They were all staring at him with expressions that ranged from fear to curiosity. Marcus spoke slowly and clearly, identifying himself as an American soldier who had become separated from his unit. He tried to remember the few French words he had learned and mixed them in with his English, hoping something would get through. Américain, soldat, ami, friend. The old man's eyes narrowed. He looked Marcus up and down, taking in his uniform, his lack of weapons, his dark skin. His expression did not change. Then one of the younger women stepped forward and said something in rapid French to the old man. Marcus caught only a few words, but her tone was warm and welcoming. She turned to him and said in heavily accented English, "You are American? You need help?" "Yes," Marcus said. "Please, we have 12 men in the hills. We need food, water, information." The young woman translated for the old man, who listened with a frown. Then he spoke at length, his voice gruff and reluctant. The young woman turned back to Marcus. "My father says the Germans are everywhere. It is dangerous to help you, but—" She hesitated. "But he says his sons were taken by the Germans, forced to work for them. He does not love the Germans. You may come in." Marcus felt a wave of relief that almost made his knees buckle. "Thank you. God bless you." They brought him inside and sat him by the fire, the first real warmth he had felt in 3 days. The elderly woman, whose name was Marie, brought him bread and cheese and a bowl of soup that tasted better than anything he had ever eaten. He devoured it gratefully, while the young woman, whose name was Claudette, asked questions about his situation. He explained as best he could. The convoy, the German tanks, the 3 days of moving through the forest. He did not know what had happened or where the American lines were now. He only knew that he needed to get his men to safety. Claudette translated for her father, whose name was Henri. The old man listened and then began to speak at length, his voice grave and his gestures emphatic. Claudette translated, "He says a great attack has begun. The Germans are trying to push through to the sea. They have taken many towns. The Americans are falling back everywhere. No one knows where the front is now. It changes by the hour." Marcus absorbed this information with a sinking feeling. If the front was moving, then their planned route might take them directly into the German advance. They would need to adjust to find another way. "Is there a safe route to the west?" he asked. "Somewhere we can go to find American forces." Claudette and Henri conferred for several minutes, arguing about something. Finally, Claudette turned back to Marcus. "My father says the town of Spa is to the west, about 15 kilometers. It was American before the attack. He does not know if it is still American now, but there is a way through the forest that avoids the main roads. He will draw you a map." Henri produced paper and pencil and began to sketch, marking hills and valleys and streams and trails with the sure hand of a man who knew this land intimately. Marcus watched and memorized, asking questions that Claudette translated. By the time Henri was finished, Marcus had a mental picture of the route that was clearer than any he had had since the ordeal began. "Thank you," he said. "How you may have saved our lives." Claudette smiled. "Go with God, monsieur, and take this." She handed him a canvas bag that the women had been filling while Henri drew the map. It contained bread, cheese, cured meat, apples, and several bottles of water. Enough food for 13 men for at least 2 days. Marcus tried to express his gratitude, but words seemed inadequate. These people had risked everything to help strangers, knowing that if the Germans found out, the consequences would be severe. It was an act of courage and humanity that humbled him. He was preparing to leave when the elderly woman, Marie, stopped him with her hand on his arm. She spoke to Claudette, who translated, "She wants to know if you are a man of God. She saw you praying when you came down the hill. Your lips were moving." Marcus nodded. "I am, or I try to be." Marie smiled and pressed something into his hand. It was a small wooden cross on a leather cord, simple and worn smooth from years of handling. She spoke again and Claudette translated, "She says you should wear this. It will remind you that you are not alone. It will give you strength." Marcus felt tears prick at his eyes. He thanked Marie and placed the cord around his neck, tucking the cross inside his shirt, where it rested against his heart. Then he made his way back up the hillside to where the others were waiting. The food from the Dubois family lifted everyone's spirits, and they devoured the bread and cheese and meat with a hunger that went beyond physical need. They had been surviving on cold rations and melted snow, and the taste of real food, prepared by human hands in a human home, reminded them that there was a world beyond this frozen forest, a world worth getting back to. Marcus shared the information he had gathered, spreading Henri's map on the ground and walking them through the route. It would take them northwest through a series of valleys and ridges, avoiding the main roads where German forces were concentrated. The terrain would be difficult, but it was their best chance of reaching American lines without being detected. They pressed on through the afternoon, making better time now that they had the benefit of daylight and a clear route to follow. Marcus led them through the forest with growing confidence, recognizing landmarks that Henri had described and adjusting their course as needed. By evening, they had covered nearly 8 miles, more than they had managed in the previous 3 days combined. They were still deep in German-controlled territory, but they were moving in the right direction. That night, as they huddled together in a shallow ravine, Turner approached Marcus with an expression that was hard to read. The hostility was still there, but it was tempered by something else, something that might have been respect. "That was a brave thing you did today," Turner said gruffly, "going down to that farmhouse alone. If it had been a trap, you'd be dead now." "It had to be done," Marcus replied, "and it worked out. Because you got lucky. Maybe. Or maybe God put that family there because he knew we needed them." Turner shook his head. "I don't believe in any of that. I've seen too much bad in this world to think there's some all-powerful being watching out for us. If there was a God, he wouldn't let things like this happen." Marcus was quiet for a moment. "I've seen bad too, Corporal. I grew up black in Mississippi. I know what cruelty looks like. I know what injustice feels like, but I've also seen good. I've seen people help strangers for no reason except that it's right. I've seen love that doesn't make any sense. I've seen courage that defies explanation. Where does that come from, if not from something greater than ourselves? Turner did not answer. He stared at Marcus for a long moment, and Marcus could see the conflict in his eyes, the struggle between the cynicism he had cultivated and the evidence of his own experience. Finally, Turner turned away and moved to his position in the ravine. But something had shifted. Marcus could feel it. The walls were beginning to come down. The fourth day of their journey was the hardest yet. They woke to find that the temperature had dropped even further, and two of the men were showing signs of frostbite on their fingers and toes. Their food was nearly gone again, and they had finished the water from the Dubois farm. Worse, they began to hear sounds of fighting to the west, which meant the front line was close, but also that they might be walking into the middle of a contested area. Marcus pushed them on, despite the difficulties, knowing that stopping now would mean never starting again. The men were at the limit of their endurance, running on willpower alone. Every step was a victory, and every mile brought them closer to safety. By mid-afternoon, they reached the edge of a large clearing and stopped short. On the far side, perhaps 200 yards away, they could see a cluster of buildings that appeared to be a small village. But between them and the village was open ground with no cover, and they could see movement among the buildings. From this distance, it was impossible to tell if the soldiers there were American or German. "We need to know before we try to cross," Marcus said. "If those are Germans and we walk out there, we're finished." "So, what do we do?" asked Private Green. "Wait here until they leave. They might not leave. And we can't stay here. We're out of food and almost out of water, and half the men can barely feel their feet anymore. We need to get to that village." It was Turner who came up with the idea. "Send someone closer to get a better look, someone who can move fast and quiet and not get spotted." Every eye turned to Marcus. He was the best woodsman among them, the one who had grown up hunting in the Mississippi forests. If anyone could get close enough to see who held the village without being detected, it was him. Marcus nodded. "All right, I'll go. Give me an hour. If I wave you forward, it's safe. If I don't come back, you continue northwest without me. Get to American lines and report." He left his rifle again, taking only a pair of binoculars and the knife from his belt. Then he began working his way around the edge of the clearing, staying in the tree line, moving with the slow, careful patience of a man who had spent his childhood stalking deer and rabbits in the Delta bottomlands. He made no sound, left no obvious track, blended into the forest like a shadow. It took him nearly 45 minutes to reach a position where he could see the village clearly. He raised his binoculars and studied the buildings, looking for any sign that would identify the soldiers there. His heart sank. German soldiers, at least 24 of them, were dug in among the buildings. He could see machine gun positions, a mortar tube, and what looked like an anti-tank gun covering the main road. The village was a strong point, part of the German defensive line, and there was no way around it that did not involve miles of backtracking they could not afford. He was about to withdraw and report the bad news when he saw something that made him freeze. Behind one of the buildings, partially hidden from the main German positions, was a small group of American soldiers. They were prisoners, 5 or 6 of them, sitting on the frozen ground with their hands tied behind their backs. Even from this distance, Marcus could see that they were in bad shape. 2 of them appeared to be injured, their uniforms stained with dried blood. He felt a cold knot form in his stomach. Those men needed help, but what could 13 supply troops do against a fortified position with over 20 enemy soldiers? It would be suicide to attempt a rescue. The smart thing, the tactical thing, was to find another route and leave those prisoners to their fate. Marcus closed his eyes and prayed. He prayed for guidance, for wisdom, for the courage to do what was right. And slowly, piece by piece, a plan began to form in his mind. It was desperate and dangerous, with 1,000 things that could go wrong. But it might work. It might just work. He made his way back to where the others were waiting, moving quickly now, driven by a sense of urgency that overrode his usual caution. He gathered the men together and told them what he had seen, the German positions, the prisoners, the layout of the village. Then he told them his plan. They would wait until full darkness, about 3 hours away. Then they would split into two groups. The first group, led by Turner, would take the machine gun and position themselves on a low ridge to the north of the village. Their job was to create a diversion, opening fire on the German positions and making as much noise as possible, making the Germans think they were facing an attack from that direction. The second group, led by Marcus, would use the diversion to approach from the south, reach the prisoners, free them and escape into the forest before the Germans could respond. Turner stared at him in disbelief. "That's insane. We don't have enough ammunition for a sustained firefight. Once the Germans figure out how few we are, they'll counterattack and wipe us out." "That's why we don't stay to fight," Marcus replied. "Your group fires for 3 minutes, no more. Make it count. Make them think they're facing a larger force, and then you withdraw into the forest and make your way to the rally point I'm going to show you. By then, we'll have the prisoners and be gone." 3 minutes isn't very long to rescue 6 men. It's long enough if we move fast. And it's better than leaving those men to whatever the Germans have planned for them. Turner stared at him. "You'd risk all our lives for a handful of strangers." "They're not strangers. They're American soldiers. They're us if things had gone a little differently, and I'm not going to walk away from them." There was a long silence. The men looked at each other, weighing the risks, calculating the odds. It was a fool's mission, the kind of thing that got everyone involved captured or worse. But there was something in Marcus's voice, a certainty and conviction that made it hard to say no. Finally, Private Foster spoke up. "I'm in. Tell me what to do." One by one, the others agreed. Even Turner, after a long moment, gave a curt nod. "Fine. But if this goes wrong, I'm going to spend eternity reminding you it was your idea." Marcus smiled slightly. "Fair enough." They spent the next 3 hours preparing. Marcus positioned Turner's group on the ridge and showed them exactly where to aim to create the impression of an attack from the north. He marked the approach route for his own group, identifying every piece of cover they could use on their way to the prisoners. He designated a rally point in the forest, a mile to the west, where both groups would meet after the operation. He synchronized watches and rehearsed the timing until everyone understood exactly what they needed to do and when they needed to do it. Then, as darkness fell and the temperature plummeted, Marcus gathered his group for one final moment. There were 6 of them, including himself, Foster, Green, and 3 others. They were mechanics and drivers and clerks, men who had never been trained for this kind of mission, who had never imagined themselves in this situation, but they were here, and they were ready. "I know this is dangerous," Marcus said quietly. "I know we might not all make it, but I want you to know something. Whatever happens tonight, I'm proud to be here with you. Every one of you has shown more courage than you knew you had, and I believe, with all my heart, that we're going to succeed. Not because we're better soldiers than the Germans, but because we're fighting for something worth fighting for. We're fighting to save lives. There's no better reason than that." He bowed his head and led them in a short prayer, asking for protection and guidance and strength. The men bowed their heads with him, even Turner's group on the ridge, visible in the darkness only as huddled shapes against the snow. When the prayer was finished, Marcus touched the wooden cross that hung against his chest and felt a surge of calm certainty flow through him. "Let's go," he said. At 2200 hours, Marcus gave the signal. Turner's group opened fire from the ridge, the machine gun chattering and rifles cracking in the darkness. The effect was immediate. Shouts erupted from the German positions, and return fire began pouring toward the ridge. Flares went up, bathing the clearing in harsh white light, but they were aimed to the north, away from where Marcus and his group were approaching from the south. They moved fast, staying low, using every shadow and fold in the ground for cover. Marcus was in the lead, his heart pounding, his senses hyper-alert. Behind him came Foster, Green, and the others, all of them moving with a focus and discipline that would have been impossible 4 days ago. They had become a team, bound together by shared hardship and a common purpose, and they moved as one. They reached the edge of the village and pressed against the wall of a stone barn, waiting for a gap in the German attention. Marcus could hear the chaos on the other side of the village, the shouts and gunfire and confusion as the Germans tried to respond to what they thought was an attack. It was working. It was actually working. Then he saw his chance. A German officer began shouting orders, trying to organize his men and direct them toward the ridge. The attention of the entire garrison shifted northward, away from the prisoners. Marcus seized the moment and led his group around the barn to where the prisoners were being held. The prisoners looked up in disbelief as Marcus appeared out of the darkness. There were 6 of them, all from an infantry unit that had been overrun 2 days earlier. 2 were injured and would need to be carried. The others were weakened by cold and hunger, but still able to move on their own. Marcus wasted no time. He cut their bonds with his knife and helped them to their feet. "Can you walk?" he asked the ones who were not injured. "We can run if we have to," one of them replied. He was a young lieutenant with a gash on his forehead and determination in his eyes. "Then let's go." They moved out, supporting the injured between them, heading for the forest to the south. Behind them, the sound of gunfire continued, but it was already starting to slacken. Turner would be withdrawing any moment now. They needed to be clear of the village before the Germans realized what had happened. They were halfway across the open ground when a shout went up behind them. Someone had discovered the prisoners were gone. Marcus heard footsteps pounding in pursuit and the crack of rifle fire. A round whistled past his head, close enough that he felt the wind of its passage. "Keep moving," he shouted. "Don't stop." The tree line was 50 yards away, then 40, then 30. Marcus could feel his lungs burning, his legs threatening to give out. Beside him, Foster was struggling to support an injured man who was barely conscious. Behind them, the pursuit was getting closer. 20 yards, 10. And then they were in the trees, plunging into the darkness of the forest, branches whipping at their faces, roots grabbing at their feet. They ran until they could not run anymore, then walked until they could not walk anymore, then collapsed in a hollow surrounded by thick undergrowth and lay there gasping for air. Marcus counted heads. All 6 prisoners, all 6 of his own men, no one left behind. He felt a wave of relief so intense it almost made him weep. They had done it. They had actually done it. 30 minutes later, Turner's group found them at the rally point. Turner was the last to arrive, breathing hard, a wild look in his eyes. He had a graze on his arm where a round had nicked him, but otherwise he and his men were unharmed. "That was the craziest thing I've ever done," Turner said. "I don't know how we made it." "We made it because everyone did their job," Marcus replied. "You bought us the time we needed. Thank you." Turner looked at him for a long moment. Then, slowly, he extended his hand. Marcus took it, and they shook. No words were necessary. They had 19 men now, 6 of them former prisoners who needed medical attention. They had almost no ammunition left and no food at all, but they had survived the night, and they had done something that mattered. That was enough. The next morning, December 20th, was the longest day of Marcus Jefferson's life. They moved northwest through terrain that seemed designed to torment them, steep hills and deep ravines and patches of ice that sent men tumbling. The 2 most seriously injured prisoners needed to be carried on improvised stretchers, which slowed the group to a crawl. Twice they had to halt and hide when German patrols passed nearby. By mid-afternoon they had covered barely 5 miles, and everyone was nearing the limit of their endurance. It was Private Green who spotted the smoke. It was rising from somewhere ahead, thick and dark, the kind of smoke that came from burning vehicles. They approached cautiously and found themselves looking down at a road that had been the scene of a fierce engagement. 6 American vehicles were burning or had already burned out, their frames twisted and blackened. The debris of conflict was scattered across the pavement and into the ditches on either side. But not everyone was beyond help. Marcus heard a weak voice calling out and traced it to an overturned jeep at the edge of the road. Beneath the jeep, pinned by the wreckage, was an American officer with captain's bars on his collar. His leg was clearly broken, and he was in bad shape. But he was alive. They lifted the jeep off him and pulled him free. Marcus knelt beside him and gave him water from one of their last canteens. "Hold on, sir. We're going to get you out of here." The captain's eyes focused on Marcus. "Who are you?" "Corporal Marcus Jefferson, 333rd Quartermaster. We've been trying to get back to American lines for 4 days." The captain nodded weakly. "You're close. American positions are about 3 miles north of here. But the Germans are between you and them. There's been fighting all through these woods. Can you tell us the best route? The captain described a path that would take them through a series of ravines and avoid the main German concentrations. He had been over the ground himself before his unit was ambushed, and he knew it well. It was the first real intelligence they had received since the ordeal began, and it gave Marcus hope that they might actually make it. They fashioned a stretcher for the captain and added him to their number. 20 men now, 4 of them unable to walk under their own power. The stretcher teams rotated every 15 minutes, but even so, the effort of carrying injured men through rough terrain was taking a savage toll. Marcus pushed them on, knowing that if they stopped now, they might never start again. As darkness began to fall, they entered the ravine system the captain had described. It was good cover, but the footing was treacherous and twice men fell and had to be helped back up. Marcus was on point again, navigating by the captain's directions and his own increasingly exhausted instincts, when he rounded a bend and found himself face to face with a German soldier. The German was young, no more than 18 or 19, with a rifle in his hands and a look of utter shock on his face. For a frozen moment they stared at each other, 2 men from opposite sides of a conflict, neither one prepared for this encounter. Then the German raised his rifle to fire. Marcus did not think. He simply moved, closing the distance between them before the young soldier could pull the trigger. They grappled for the weapon, struggling in the snow, and Marcus managed to wrench it free and throw it aside. The German tried to reach for his sidearm, but Marcus caught his wrist and held it. "Don't," Marcus said. "Don't make me hurt you." The German stopped struggling. He looked up at Marcus with eyes full of fear, and he said something in German that Marcus did not understand. But the tone was clear. He was pleading. He was terrified. Marcus made a decision. He released the young soldier and stepped back, his hands raised to show he meant no further harm. "Go," he said. "Go that way." He pointed down the ravine away from the direction they were traveling. "You don't follow us, you go back to your own lines, understand?" The German nodded frantically. He scrambled to his feet and ran, disappearing into the darkness without looking back. Turner appeared beside Marcus, breathing hard. "What happened?" "We heard a commotion." "German soldier. He's gone." "You let him go." "He was just a boy. He was scared out of his mind. I wasn't going to—" Marcus paused. "I wasn't going to do anything I'd regret." Turner stared at him. "He'll report our position. He'll bring others. Maybe. Or maybe he'll just be glad to be alive and keep his mouth shut. Either way, I did what I thought was right." "This isn't Sunday school, Jefferson. This is— I know what it is, Corporal, and I know who I am. I'm not going to lose my soul out here, not for anyone." Turner stared at him for a long moment, and Marcus could see the conflict in his expression. Part of him wanted to argue, to insist that Marcus had made a dangerous mistake. But another part, perhaps a larger part than Turner wanted to admit, understood. There were some things more important than survival. There were some lines you did not cross no matter what. "Let's keep moving," Turner said finally. "We're almost there." They pressed on through the night, slower now but still moving. Marcus pushed them past midnight, past the point of exhaustion, past everything they thought they could endure. And then, just as the first grey light of dawn was beginning to appear in the east, they heard a sound that made Marcus's heart leap, an American voice, speaking English, coming from somewhere ahead. "Halt! Identify yourselves!" Marcus raised his hands and stepped forward into the open. "Corporal Marcus Jefferson, 333rd Quartermaster Company. We have 19 men, 4 wounded. We are Americans." There was a moment of silence, and then figures emerged from the trees ahead. American soldiers, rifles ready but not aimed, approaching cautiously. The lead man, a sergeant with a lined face and exhausted eyes, looked them over and then lowered his weapon. "Well, I'll be damned," he said. "Where did you all come from?" "It's a long story, Sergeant. Right now we need medics for our wounded and something to eat." The sergeant nodded and turned to give orders. Within minutes, medics were attending to the injured, and the rest of the men were being led toward a cluster of tents that served as the battalion aid station. They had made it. After 4 days behind enemy lines, after everything they had been through, they had made it. Marcus stood at the edge of the camp, watching his men being cared for, and felt the tension that had been holding him together finally begin to release. He closed his eyes and offered a prayer of thanksgiving, tears streaming down his face. A hand touched his shoulder. He turned to find Turner standing there, looking at him with an expression that was almost gentle. "I owe you an apology," Turner said quietly. "I've been hard on you this whole time. I mocked your faith and doubted your leadership, and you saved us all." Marcus shook his head. "I didn't save anyone, Corporal. We saved each other. That's how it works." Turner was silent for a moment. Then he said, "I don't know if I believe in God. I don't know if I ever will. But I believe in you, Jefferson. I saw what you did out there. The risks you took, the way you held us together, the mercy you showed to that German kid. I've never seen anything like it. I just did what my father taught me to do, what my faith teaches me to do. Maybe. But there's plenty of people with faith who couldn't have done what you did. So whatever you've got, wherever it comes from, I'm glad it was there when we needed it." They shook hands, and this time there was real warmth in it. Something had changed between them, something that went beyond the simple resolution of a conflict. They had become brothers. The immediate aftermath of their escape brought a flurry of activity. The battalion commander, a lieutenant colonel named Harrison, debriefed Marcus personally and was astonished by the story he heard. A supply convoy cut off by the German offensive, a journey of more than 50 miles through enemy territory, a daring rescue of prisoners from a fortified village. It was the kind of story that would be hard to believe if it had not been corroborated by 19 other witnesses. Lieutenant Colonel Harrison recommended Marcus for the Bronze Star for valor, and the award was approved within days. Marcus received the medal at a brief ceremony at battalion headquarters, with the surviving members of his group in attendance. He was embarrassed by the attention and kept his remarks short, thanking God and his fellow soldiers, and expressing his hope that they would all make it home safely when the conflict ended. The men he had led through those 4 desperate days were scattered to various units as replacements, but they stayed in touch when they could. Turner was sent to a combat engineer unit and would serve with distinction for the remainder of the conflict. Foster was assigned to another quartermaster company and eventually rose to the rank of sergeant. Green remained with the 333rd and became one of their best mechanics, following in Marcus's footsteps. The prisoners they had rescued were a revelation. Several of them sought out Marcus specifically to thank him, and one of them, a lieutenant named Robert Mitchell from Ohio, told him something that Marcus would never forget. "When we were sitting there with our hands tied, watching those Germans prepare their positions, I had given up hope," Mitchell said. "I was sure we were going to be marched off to some camp and forgotten. And then you appeared out of the darkness like an answer to a prayer I hadn't even known I was saying. You didn't just save our lives. Corporal, you restored our faith in what we're fighting for." Marcus was moved by the words, but he deflected the praise as he always did. "I just did what anyone would have done." "No," Mitchell said firmly. "That's not true. Most people would have walked past us. Most people would have said it was too risky. The mission was to get their own men home. And they couldn't afford to take on a German strongpoint. You didn't say any of that. You saw men who needed help and you helped them. That's rare, Corporal. That's precious. Don't diminish it." The great German offensive, which came to be known as the Battle of the Bulge, raged for another month after Marcus and his men reached safety. It was the largest and bloodiest engagement fought by American forces during the conflict in Europe, involving over 600,000 American troops and resulting in more than 80,000 casualties before the German advance was finally stopped and rolled back. The 333rd Quartermaster Company played its part throughout, continuing to move supplies to the front lines despite the constant danger and the terrible conditions. Marcus led his section with the same quiet competence he had shown before, earning the respect of everyone he worked with. But something had changed. The men who had been through those 4 days in the Ardennes talked about what they had experienced, and their stories spread. The tale of Corporal Jefferson, the man who prayed instead of panicked, the man who led a supply unit through impossible odds, the man who risked everything to rescue strangers, became something of a legend within the battalion and beyond. Men who had never met Marcus sought him out just to shake his hand. Others who had once mocked his faith now found themselves thinking about it in a different way. Turner underwent the most visible transformation. After returning to American lines, he spent 3 days in the aid station being treated for frostbite and exhaustion. When he emerged, he sought out Marcus and asked if they could talk. They sat together on ammunition crates behind the mess tent, and Turner spoke with an honesty and vulnerability that would have been unimaginable just a week earlier. "I've been thinking a lot about what happened out there," Turner said. "The way you handled things. The way you stayed calm when everything was falling apart. I've been in tough spots before, but I've never seen anything like that." Marcus nodded, waiting. "I told you I don't know if I believe in God," Turner continued. "And I still don't, not the way you do. But I saw something in you that I can't explain any other way. There was a peace about you, even when things were at their worst. Like you knew something the rest of us didn't. Like you had a source of strength we couldn't see." "I do," Marcus said simply. "That's what faith is." Turner looked at him. "I want to understand it. I'm not saying I'm going to start going to church or reading the Bible, but I want to understand what gives you that peace. Can you help me with that?" Marcus smiled. "I can try, but I have to warn you. It's not something I can just explain. It's something you have to experience. It's a relationship, not a formula." "A relationship with what? With God?" "With the truth of who you are and why you're here. With the love that created you and holds you up even when you don't feel it. With the part of yourself that knows, deep down, that there's something more to this life than just getting through it." Turner was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "That's a lot to take in." "I know, but you asked." "I did. And I'm glad I did." He paused. "Thank you, Jefferson, for everything. Thank you for trusting me when you didn't have any reason to. That meant more than you know." They shook hands once more, and Marcus saw something new in Turner's eyes. Not belief, not yet, but openness, a willingness to consider possibilities he had always rejected. And that was a beginning. The global conflict in Europe ended on May 8, 1945, with the unconditional surrender of Germany. Marcus was in Antwerp when the news came, overseeing a supply depot that had become one of the largest in the theater. The celebration lasted all night, men laughing and crying and embracing each other, and Marcus joined in the joy even as he prayed for those who had not lived to see this day. He was discharged from the army in October of 1945 and returned to Greenwood, Mississippi, where his family welcomed him home with a celebration at Mount Zion Baptist Church. His father, who had grown old during the years Marcus was away, wept openly as he embraced his son. His mother held the wooden cross that Marcus had worn throughout his service, the cross that Marie Dubois had given him in that farmhouse in Belgium, and told him she had known, from the moment she learned he was missing, that he would be protected. "I prayed for you every day," Bessie said, tears streaming down her face. "Every single day, and now here you are." "Here I am," Marcus agreed, "thanks to a lot of people, and thanks to you." The return to civilian life was not easy. The Mississippi Marcus came home to was the same place it had been when he left, still segregated, still offering limited opportunities to black men, no matter what they had done or sacrificed. He went back to work at the cotton gin, using his mechanical skills to rebuild equipment that had deteriorated during the conflict years. He joined his father as a deacon at Mount Zion and taught Sunday school to the children of the congregation, sharing with them the lessons he had learned about faith and service and the importance of treating every person with dignity. But the experience of those 4 days in the Ardennes had changed him in ways that could not be easily expressed. He had seen what people were capable of when they were pushed to their limits. He had seen fear and courage, cruelty and compassion, despair and faith, all tangled together in the same moments and the same hearts. And he had learned that the walls people built between themselves, walls of prejudice and suspicion and pride, could be broken down when circumstances forced them to see each other as human beings. He began speaking at churches and community gatherings about his experiences, not to glorify what he had done, but to share the lessons he had learned. He talked about the importance of faith in times of trouble, about the power of working together across differences, about the capacity for redemption that exists in every heart. He spoke about James Turner without using his name, describing how a man who had mocked him and doubted him had become a brother through their shared ordeal. "That's what's possible," Marcus would say. "That's what happens when we stop seeing each other as enemies and start seeing each other as children of God." Among those who listened most attentively was a young woman named Dorothy Williams, a schoolteacher in Greenwood who had grown up in the same church as Marcus, but had been too young for him to notice before the conflict. She was intelligent and kind, and shared his deep faith, and she found herself drawn to the quiet strength that seemed to radiate from him whenever he spoke about his experiences. They courted for a year, taking long walks along the dirt roads that wound through the cotton fields, sitting on the porch of her parents' house, talking about their hopes and dreams, attending church together every Sunday and Wednesday. Marcus told her everything about those 4 days in Belgium, holding nothing back, wanting her to know who he really was and what he had been through. Dorothy listened with tears in her eyes and told him she had never known anyone like him. They were married in June of 1947, with Deacon Samuel Jefferson presiding over the ceremony in the sanctuary of Mount Zion Baptist Church. The whole community came out to celebrate, filling the pews and spilling onto the lawn, and Marcus looked at the faces around him and felt a sense of completeness he had never known before. He had come home, he had found his place, and now he was starting a family of his own. Over the next 15 years they had 4 children, 2 sons and 2 daughters, and Marcus tried to raise them the way his parents had raised him, with discipline and love and an unshakable foundation of faith. Every morning before dawn, he would gather them in the kitchen for devotions, leading them through hymns and scripture and prayers, instilling in them the same rhythms that had shaped his own life. He taught them that prayer was not passive, that faith without works was dead, that they had a responsibility to use their gifts in service of others. The letters started arriving in 1946, the first one postmarked from Chicago. It was from James Turner, who had returned to his old neighborhood, but found himself unable to settle back into his former life. The things he had seen and done in Europe had changed him, and the narrow world of numbers and hustles that had once been enough no longer satisfied him. "I keep thinking about what you said," Turner wrote, "about finding something greater than yourself. I'm looking for it, Jefferson. I don't know if I'll find it, but I'm looking." Marcus wrote back with encouragement and scripture references and an invitation to visit Mississippi anytime he wanted. It was the beginning of a correspondence that would last for decades as the 2 men stayed connected across the miles and years, sharing their struggles and their victories, their doubts and their discoveries. More letters came from others who had been part of that small band of survivors. William Foster wrote from Atlanta about becoming a deacon. Albert Green wrote from army postings worldwide. Robert Mitchell, the lieutenant they rescued, became a minister in Ohio and credited Marcus with saving his soul. Turner visited Mississippi in 1952. They sat on Marcus's porch, talking for hours. "I started going to church," Turner admitted. "A little Baptist congregation. I sit in back and listen. It reminds me of you." Marcus smiled. "That's a good start." The years passed. Marcus watched his children grow, his congregation flourish, his country slowly change. He supported the civil rights movement, registered voters, opened Mount Zion for organizing meetings. He never stopped teaching the lessons from those 4 days in Belgium. Marcus Jefferson died on February 14, 2003, at 80 years old, surrounded by family. His funeral at Mount Zion drew hundreds. Albert Green, 90 years old, delivered the tribute, "I've never known anyone like Marcus Jefferson. He was the real thing." The wooden cross Marie Dubois gave him was buried with him. His legacy lives on in everyone he touched. The walls came down, the ripples keep spreading, they always do. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.